everyone. This is our final video and it's about civil rights, a very important topic. And just to kind of recap, the last time I did a video it was about civil liberties, and hopefully you know that civil liberties are about individual freedoms. Civil rights deal with groups that have been historically discriminated against. And so on a rare occasion you may have something that is both a civil rights and a civil liberties issue. You know, for example, if somebody's being discriminated against because they belong to a religious group, that could be a civil rights issue, but it's also a civil liberties issue. But we're going to talk about the three groups that are in the lecture this week, starting with racial minorities. For anybody who's familiar with the history of the United States, you know that racial discrimination really started when Europeans first landed on the shores of what would become the United States. And there was a discrimination against Native Americans. There were a lot of really terrible things that happened to Native Americans that was justified because of their skin color and because of their cultural differences with that of Europeans. Then in 1619, as the Virginia colony started making a lot more money and expanded, the first slave who came from Africa was actually brought into that colony. And so what you then have in early American history, you have an effort to enslave Native Americans, and you also have an influx of people from Africa, either directly from Africa or via from the Caribbean. Keep in mind, the Spanish had been trading people from the African continent for well over a century at this point, brought into the American South. And of course, every state at one point actually allowed, or what would become every state, slavery was actually legal in, but it comes to dominate the American South. And so in your reading this week, you're going to read about the amendments that are passed after the Civil War, which are the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. They are considered to be the Reconstruction Amendments. And the 13th Amendment actually forbids any kind of slavery or involuntary servitude. The 14th Amendment granted citizenship to former slaves, and it also included a due process clause. In the last video, we talked about how the due process clause in the 5th Amendment held the federal government to a certain standard when it came to the treatment of groups of people. In the 14th Amendment, the due process clause is a little more well defined. Plus two, it says that states also have to provide due process for people. And this is a reaction to a lot of the violence that African Americans faced after the Civil War was over, especially in, former Confederate states. The 15th Amendment, which came in 1870, granted universal male suffrage. The people like Susan B. Anthony were actually hoping that it would just be universal suffrage for all citizens, but Susan didn't get her wish, and the following year, in 1871, she got arrested voting and was sent to jail. So, yeah. But these are all amendments that were meant to try to encourage people to treat each other equally and make sure that the government had to treat people equally. Well, for those of you familiar with American history, you know that there's a lot of things that took place to kind of unravel what these amendments were intended to do. For example, by the late 1800s, it's very, very common for states to pass laws that are meant to disenfranchise voters, especially African American voters. And of course, it ushers in an era called Jim Crow, where, the government, even though legally is obligated to do one thing, a lot of laws are getting passed. And things like, curfews for certain people at night are getting passed. Voting-wise, there are things like literacy tests and grandfather clauses and poll taxes that are being implemented that are clearly meant to try to keep people from voting and to keep people from having full citizenship. So after World War II, though, the tide kind of turned. World War II, for one, the United States fought the Nazis, and the Nazis are extremely racist. And so you do have a lot more kind of renewed vigor for trying to create an equal environment here in the United States after World War II. In 1954, Thurgood Marshall, on behalf of the NAACP, took a court case to the Supreme Court that managed to overturn a case from the 1890s that had upheld segregation as being constitutional. The court case from the 1950s was Brown versus the Topeka Board of Education. And in addition to that, within about a decade after that court case, the federal government had started trying to also address legislatively issues that the court case itself did not address. And so In 1964, the federal government passed, or Congress passed, a Civil Rights Act, which was signed by Lyndon Johnson into law, and it forbids discrimination based upon race, color, national origin, religion, and sex. So it did a lot for people who had been discriminated against because of the color of their skin. It also did a lot for females who oftentimes were in the workplace treated very differently and not allowed to, move their way up because they were women. In addition to that, it includes religion, because, the protection that comes with the Civil Rights Act is that, people do have a right to believe what they want to religiously without facing discrimination because of that reason. In 1965, Congress passed a Voting Rights Act, and the Voting Rights Act actually allowed for the elimination of many of the things that had been common in southern states and sometimes non-southern states in the late 1800s and early 1900s, those things that were enacted that were meant to try to deter people from voting. And so, for example, you can't charge any kind of amount of money for voting, because if that happens, it's obvious that that's going to disenfranchise a lot of poor people in this country. And everybody has the constitutional right to vote, unless you're in some states that don't allow felons to vote. But if you're a U.S. citizen, that is sort of considered to be a fundamental right. So, for example, if this has led into a lot of the controversy requiring IDs. Because if you go to most driver's license bureaus or revenue offices, they don't give those for free. And so it's interesting to see how the courts have ruled about that, because the argument is that if you have to present something that costs money in order to vote, that could be in violation of the Voting Rights Act. I do want to talk about women, because as I mentioned to you, the Civil Rights Act actually does a great deal for women. Of course, the suffrage movement is a long movement in U.S. history. Women, even John Adams, his wife, was somebody who kind of chastised him and his friends for not letting women vote, back in the 1790s. But the women's suffrage movement gains a lot of momentum in the mid-1800s, and suffrage, of course, means voting rights. And after the Civil War, women like Susan B. Anthony fought to try to get an amendment into the Constitution, much like the 15th Amendment, but one that just said ladies can vote too. That's not the actual wording, by the way. But what will become the 19th Amendment is enacted in 1920, and it allows for universal female suffrage. And so that particular amendment, the woman who really pushed for it was a woman named Alice Paul. And there's a good movie about her called Iron-Jawed Angels, if you ever want to watch it. Hilary Swank does a fantastic job portraying her. But many of you probably know that a lot of that came from World War I. World War I was a war where a lot of them, we had, millions of men taken out of the workforce in order to go fight. And they left jobs in industry at a time where a lot of goods were being manufactured for the war. And the women took over running the railroads, a lot of the industry. And so it's very difficult for people after World War I to try to make a case that women weren't capable of doing what men were doing, because they had actually done all the things that men had done. In addition, though, to women's rights, it's important to know, too, that a large part of women's rights has been the discussion of ownership for women over their own bodies. If you want to look her up, Margaret Sanger was actually an early feminist in the early 1900s who was a big advocate for teaching birth control practices. She actually got arrested for that, and it was considered to be lewd conduct to talk about such things publicly. But Margaret Sanger argued that women really should not be treated as basically breeding objects. And so a large part of the women's movement has also encompassed this idea that women, at one time were considered to be more like property to their husbands. And, the rule of thumb comes from, some laws that stated you couldn't beat your wife with anything wider than your thumb. So just mentioning all of this because a lot of what happens after the Voting Rights Act, the passage of the 19th Amendment, is the conversation then goes more towards like equality. For example, Alice Paul actually wrote an Equal Rights Amendment in the early 1920s that she hoped would be a follow-up to the 19th Amendment. And the Equal Rights Amendment said that you weren't allowed to discriminate against anybody based upon sex, because one covers voting. There's a difference between that and actual discrimination. The Equal Rights Amendment, or the ERA, never got enough votes to be ratified, and every once in a while it's still brought up because it's only a few states short. By the way, Arkansas did not ratify it. It's one of the ones that eventually sometimes the discussion is brought up to go ahead and bring it back and do that. I do also want to mention the rights of the disabled, because if you go back to the Civil Rights era, there are so many different things that are discussed and talked about. Really, who are we going to be as a country? How do we want to treat people? And so that obviously involves discussions about people who are racial minorities and women. And during the late 60s and 70s, there's actually some legislation passed to help protect people who are disabled in the workplace. I also want to point out too, it's when we started to see more of a discussion about our environment. Things like, Richard Nixon actually formed the EPA, or actually was the president who supported the formation of the EPA in the early 1970s, as a sense of, if we want people to be healthy and we want to be sustainable, we need to start kind of taking care of other things too. But in the 70s, for example, there's legislation passed to try to protect people who might not be have equal access to education because of a disability. It's also the same decade legislation is passed saying that you can't discriminate against a pregnant woman in the workplace. But really, throughout the 1980s, there was a huge push to do even more. And so what a lot of people pushed for was having an act that would be comparable to like the Civil Rights Act, but having it to address people who were disabled. And so that act actually came. In 1990, the Americans with Disabilities Act was passed through Congress, and it was signed by George Herbert Walker Bush. And what the Americans with Disabilities Act does is it provides for equal treatment in transportation, in public places, and education. Some of you may still go into a bathroom, for example, that's a public bathroom, where you might look on the floor and it's obvious that what used to be two stalls, one was broken out and now is made into one, because there were a lot of overhauls that had to be made. Because if it is within somebody's ability to do a job, then it needs to happen. I had an older sister who worked for an airline, and after this particular act was passed, the airline actually invested a lot of money in bringing in braille boards for people who had visual impairments to be able to take reservations and to do things like that. Places have to have things like ramps and have to have doorways that are wide enough for wheelchairs to go through. And I think one of the things that's always stood out to me is, why did that take so long? People with disabilities, it comes decades after a lot of the other civil rights discussions, I guess is what I'm saying. But it's a very, very important piece of legislation. And it's certainly one of the things that I think President Bush, before he passed, was one most proud of. So, as always, if you have any questions over the material this week, please let me know. I also want to tell you it's been really great having you in class this semester. Hopefully you've gone away with, some more understanding about the United States government and how important it is to understand the legislative process, and how very important it is to understand your place in a democracy. Take care.